Hi, Elle. I'm Monica. I'm one of the dietitians here at the hospital. The doctor had sent in a referral for you to come meet with me today just to review a diabetic diet and start talking about some diet and lifestyle changes that you can make to help your diabetes. So I know this was new for you. It's a new diagnosis. So I figured we could just check in, go over some questions if you had any, talk about the diet, talk about some lifestyle and food changes you can make to improve your A1C, which is that 3-month average of your blood sugars. And then from there, we can certainly go over any specific lifestyle questions you have. Does that sound all right? Okay, great. So I know this is new for you, but have you ever had any education in the past around healthy eating, or do you already try and follow a good diet? Do you have any family members maybe that have diabetes and you kind of watch what they eat? No, it's all new for you. Okay. All right. So let's start from the beginning then, if that's all right. Great. So first thing first, when it comes to food, the general idea for any kind of, whether it be diet style or healthy eating plan, is really moderation. So everything kind of comes back to moderation and just being mindful of what you're putting in your body. So for diabetes, we watch carbohydrates. So like you said, since this is all new for you, we'll kind of review from the beginning what carbohydrates are, what foods contain them, and then how to make sure you're not overeating them. So carbohydrates, so I have some handouts for you that you're going to take home with you as well. So if we look together at this first handout here, so it talks about carbohydrates on the top. So carbohydrates are foods that break down into glucose, which is a type of sugar. This provides us with energy, which is really great. We need this in our body. However, if we overdo it, especially if you're diabetic, that extra blood sugar just kind of circulates in there, isn't being used, and then we start to see those high values on your lab work like we were seeing. So carbohydrates, we need them. We don't want to go on a diet that eliminates everything, but we want to be mindful of the portions of these carbohydrates that we're doing because it can really make the blood sugar swing one direction or the other. So looking specifically at carbohydrates, on your handout here, it talks about what types of things are carbohydrates. So that includes foods like pasta, rice, bread, milk, fruit, juice, desserts, of course. Most people know that one, the kind of sweets. But also things like potatoes, beans. The fruit one is usually one people don't always recognize, so that's an important one to keep in mind. And again, you can still eat any of these foods. You don't have to cut them out of your diet, but we do need to watch the portion size. Does that make sense so far? Yeah, okay. And a lot of people say, I eat all these foods. I love carbs, which me too, I get it. So how do we determine how much is too much and how much is okay? So one of the things that I always recommend for people that are coming in and kind of new to this is, one, to first be aware of the foods that are carbohydrates, just watching portions, kind of trying to cut back a little bit on those things, because typically as Americans, we tend to eat a lot of these things anyway. And there are a lot of processed foods out there, convenience foods that are high. But then I also talk about carb counting. Carb counting is a great way to go about tracking how many carbs you're having, kind of watching to make sure the portions aren't too high without eliminating all these foods, and still being able to say, oh, I can still have bread, I can still have pasta, I can still have cake. It just limits the amount we're able to have and keeps it within the similar carbohydrate range from meal to meal, which helps overall keeping the blood sugars stable from meal to meal. So with that said, for most women, so for you, we'd be looking at somewhere between 45 and 60 grams of carb per meal. So I know that that doesn't mean much to you right now, but we'll talk about how to determine what that looks like. And then we'd be looking for somewhere between 15 and 20 grams of carb per snack. So talking about the carbs, we want to shoot for better quality carbs when possible, and we'll talk about how to count them and how to know those numbers, but the quality is the first thing you want to pay attention to. Ideally, we want to do carbohydrates that have more fiber and more whole grains whenever possible, and more whole foods versus processed foods. So for instance, if we were going to have fruit, if we were going to have fruit as one of our carbohydrate sources at a meal, we want to try and do the whole fruit, an apple or an orange, not apple juice or orange juice or apple pie. We want to try and stick to the whole fruit version. It's much healthier for us, has more fiber, which is not only good for our diabetes control, but also good for our digestion and keeps us full and satisfied, which is a nice side effect also. We want to shoot for whole grain versions. So for instance, when we're doing bread, instead of doing white bread, maybe whole wheat bread, or instead of doing white potato, sweet potato, or white pasta, whole wheat pasta. So whenever possible, we want to swap out for that whole grain, higher fiber, complex carb instead of those simple white, kind of easy digested, but also make our blood sugars go higher quicker carbs. So that being said, those kind of touch on the quality, but as far as the numbers, you can kind of make anything work in moderation and in the correct portion. So if we're looking at carbohydrates between 45 and 60 grams of carb per meal is recommended for women. So for you, and this is a starting point, we may adjust it as time goes on. If you have low blood sugars, we might say, oh, you need more. If you have high blood sugar still at that range, we might shoot for the lower end. So for you, there's two ways to kind of figure out what those numbers look like, because most people say, yeah, I hear the number, but I don't know what that means, right? So the carbohydrates are found on a food label. So if you've ever looked at a food label before, most people have glanced at it for either calories or fat or something in the past, maybe not always carbohydrates. But on the second handout that I'm going to give you to take home today, it has the food label. So basically what we'd be looking for, the most important things on this food label for you, for diabetes, would be up top here. We're looking at the serving size. That's the first thing we should always look at in a food label. So that kind of shows us what all the numbers below are actually for. We might not eat this amount, we might eat more or less, but then we adjust these numbers accordingly. So everything listed is for this serving size. So for instance, this example we have is for half a cup. So if we eat half a cup, great. Here's the numbers for it. If we eat a full cup, then we double all the numbers. If we eat a quarter cup, we can cut all the numbers in half. So we want to look at that first just to see what we're dealing with. And then we come down here and we look at the total carbs. This is a really important spot because all of these carbohydrates turn into sugar in our body. And a lot of times we forget that. We just look down here. A lot of people look at the sugars and say, oh, this is great. It only has 4 grams of sugar. Great, I can eat this. It's low sugar. But now if I look at the total carbohydrate, it says 46 grams of carbohydrates. That's a lot different. So, and all these break down into a form of glucose, which is a sugar. So it is important to look at the total number. When we look at fiber, sometimes people will subtract it out, sometimes they won't from the total number. I typically tell people not to bother with that, to kind of just be mindful that the higher fiber foods are usually better quality for us, and those are better for us than the white stuff, the white simple carbs. But it still all kind of factors in. So it's good to look at the total carbohydrate because at the end of the day, carb counting is kind of an estimate anyway. It's not an exact science. The other thing important on the to look at on the food label is the sugar part, so the no added sugar. This is new to the food labels, and this is really helpful because if we see a food that has a lot of sugar, well, maybe it's because it has a lot of fruit in it. But if we see it's added sugar, we know it's kind of that extra junk sugar put in. So not to say we should eliminate the food altogether, but it should be one we're eating less often. So again, looking at the quality of the carbs. So the food label is pretty easy because it has the portion, it has the number. So you just add that up for every food that's in your meal that is a carbohydrate. And if the total is between 45 and 60, you're doing a good job. If the total's over that, we need to cut down on something to kind of get it into that range. If it's a snack, again, we're talking about the lower numbers, that 15 to 20 grams of carb. So you'd want to adjust accordingly. The other way to look at carb counting, so that's the first way and obviously the easiest. If you have the label, use it, it's right there. If you don't have a food label, then we look down here and it has a little cheat sheet on your handout for you. And down here at the bottom, it talks about what one serving size of some of our common non-labeled foods might be, like rice, for instance, or potato. So it talks about how half a cup of potatoes is 1 serving, which every 1 serving, and it says it right on here, is 15 grams worth of carbs. So for every half a cup for potato, it's 15 grams of carb. For every 1/3 cup of cooked rice or pasta, it's 15 grams of carb. So if you have a full cup of rice or pasta, that's 3 servings. So we multiply 15 by 3, and that's 45 grams of carb, which for you would be kind of the lower end of your range for your carbohydrates at a mealtime. So you could have a full cup of pasta or rice, a nice green leafy vegetable that's not high in carbs, and a lean protein like chicken or fish, and you have a nice well-rounded meal, still have a lot of food, but the carbs are not going too high. Versus if you just had a big bowl of pasta for dinner, maybe you have 2 or 3 cups of pasta, which I don't know about you, but I like pasta, so I could eat that. And then we're getting really high in the carbs because we think every 1 cup is 45 grams. If we have 2 or 3 cups of pasta, that's over 100 grams of carbohydrate at that meal, which is a lot, and that makes our blood sugar go up. And at the end of the day, the goal is to keep the blood sugar down. So do you have any questions on either the food items that have carbohydrates or the food label? No? Great. Do you think that it's something that you might be able to try? It's going to take some time. It doesn't happen overnight, but do you think that would be something that you would be willing to try and track your carbohydrates for a few days and just, see how things go and try and keep them within that range? Great. So all of these, everything's written down that we talked about, as is the ranges. So you kind of have this to look back on. Again, it doesn't happen overnight. So just start to work on identifying the carbs, then reducing the portions, then start to do the counting part. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to check back in say 2 weeks, and that'll give us the opportunity to make sure things are going well, you don't have additional questions, and make sure that your numbers, your blood sugars, are also coming down in the process. Does that sound all right? Awesome. So we'll set you up for an appointment. I'll give you my card too that has my phone number, so you can certainly call in between if you have questions. But thank you for coming in today to check in and kind of learn some of the basics. And if you think of anything in the meantime between now and 2 weeks from now when you come back in, just give me a call. Okay, thank you.